Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining me today for our latest webinar, Optimizing and Maturing an AppSec Program. My name is Brent Jenkins with Fortify Product Marketing. Joining me today, I have two excellent panelists, both representing Micro Focus as well. First up is William Hernandez, Senior Architect for Worldwide Delivery, Strategy, and Capability. After that will be Stan Wiseman, Business Development Director for all security products within Micro Focus. Just to go over our agenda for this webinar, first we're going to be talking about why organizations need to optimize their AppSec programs. Next, we're going to talk about the evolution of maturity, the cultural shift, application security capabilities maturity model, establishing an AppSec Center of Expertise, then operating the AppSec program, and finally, customer examples of AppSec optimization. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention the fact that this is the third webinar of a three-part series. I highly recommend you check out the other two webinars that we've done so far, which can be found on Bright Talk. The first one was Getting Started with Seamless AppSec in One Day. And then secondly, fitting security into your software lifecycle with automation and integration. So before I pass it over to William, I just wanted to briefly talk about why maturing your AppSec programs is so important. If we take a look at the AppSec market today, Forrester Research found that 75% of the 1,400 IT and security practitioners surveyed think that their AppSec spending is inadequate. To further this point, 48% of the business managers perceived application performance and speed to be more important than security. Many organizations that have AppSec programs in place use the guidance provided by OWASP. While this is a great way to get you started, which we even actually covered that in our first webinar of this series, a more mature program is needed. The main statistic I think that is important to point out here is that over 60% of the applications tested by our software security research team had one or more critical or high severity security flaw not covered by the OWASP top 10. So organizations that only test or mitigate security risks found within that top 10 are still very vulnerable. So with that in mind, I will now pass it off to William for his portion of the webinar. The floor is yours, William.
Hello and welcome to the session Optimizing and Maturing Application Security Programs. My name is Will Hernandez. Today, many businesses engage in cybersecurity, assuming that information technology will drive the resolution to most, if not all, of their cybersecurity challenges. The application security space is no different. And as enticing as this assumption may sound, it truly distorts the realities and complexities behind any application security program. Worst is, it provides a false sense of protection and security not only to the AppSec program practitioners, but also its customers and the businesses it may support. During the following minutes, we will review this fallacy and describe strategies to improve an AppSec program by means of optimizing it and maturing it. The comments that follow are based on two business cases here in the United States, one for a Fortune 500 corporation, the other one for a smaller footprint business. The names of these accounts will not be disclosed for NDA reasons. Thank you, and let's get started. A common misunderstanding exists between maturing an application security program and the evolution of application security capabilities. In the current view, we have a mix of requirements, policies, processes, and technologies. They're grouped by area of capability. However, this view does not dictate the performance, the accuracy, or level of impact of each of these capability areas. And once again, it simply groups them. Our attention is primarily focused on the type of technology and the lowest level of complexity depicted in this histogram. So if we look to the far left, where it describes the identification of risk, the correlation is that it's a very immature process and it's intentional. The concern is I can identify the level of risk, but cannot do much about it. The capability is allowing us to test applications, either dynamically or statically, and then provide a means of reporting based on the exercise that has been applied to regulators or meet a specific regulatory control. But does this risk identification group improve our security posture? What if risk mitigation, that's the group in the center, is what we actually need, yet we don't have policies in place, which are part of that policy compliance concern? What if we don't have policies in place to address or qualify technical risk, and perhaps not even determine which controls should be enforced? Is this information security policy that I'm mentioning broad enough to cover controls that are specific to certain types of applications? For example, should we use the same type of controls and rigor around our mission critical transactional systems supporting, let's say, $1 trillion worth of cash flow between different financial institutions, and perhaps a decision support platform hosted by a cloud service provider that's supporting a supply chain company? Should we use the same level of metric to describe these two systems? Do the capability allow the practitioner to ensure the eradication of certain vulnerabilities? Are we able to perhaps adapt to the ever-evolving cybersecurity risk landscape simply by following this depiction? In many sales cycles, specifically technology-oriented sales cycles, the idea of using technology and a technology deployment to accelerate maturity of a program is commonplace. So if you were to acquire these products, these licenses, and orchestrate them in a specific way, whichever it is that those systems and products are put together are attempting to achieve will be achieved in a faster, hence more mature fashion. Looking at it from that perspective, the prerequisites for acceleration in this area would primarily fall under the category of infrastructure, the servers, the network, the operating systems, the application containers, so anything that can be associated to infrastructure, the services stacks that support, in our concern, AppSec, but in a generic, more generic purview, the subject matter, and then the integrations between all those pieces. That would be the focus of a technology deployment attempting to accelerate maturity. However, it does not talk, the technology deployment, about organization and the complexities within an organization, putting together a governance program that includes policies, norms, procedures, controls, key performance indicators, areas of accountability, personnel, staff, training. It also does not address the architectural concerns, and this is one of my pet peeves, confusing architecture with infrastructure design. They're not the same thing, right? So infrastructure design, how many servers do I need? Architecture is who will use those systems? How will those systems operate? What are my areas of concern for high availability? That's one area. But other areas is how do that deployment meet the needs of my business architecture? What are the services that I'm trying to consume or provide through that hardware? And acceleration also does not include operating models. Who does what, when, how do they get engaged, monitor, and so forth. So if we look at the curve, there are four areas. There are four areas within it that we're wanting to look at. We have a startup point, which is the area of I've acquired, I want to acquire the technology, or I'm in the process of acquiring the technology, and we're ready to go. Then there's the acceleration phase where we throw hardware and software at the problem, whichever the problem might be, in this case, application security, and we'll reach a summit or zenith of capability where from that point on, again, look at the curve, we're talking about ramp up effort, and once we reach that zenith, then it should be, smooth ride down to the bottom, going through the maturity effort or the maturity cycle of that accelerated life cycle, and then fall into a beautiful, nice maintenance curve. The graphic describes or provides, again, a false sense of ease, that it should be fairly simple to get to point A, from point A, which is start point, from our starting point to our end of life, fairly simply. However, the complexity involved in the maturity section in that diagram is not described by the schematic. So if we look at it, we're missing in that 30% of acceleration. We're not talking about organization, we're not talking about governance, we're not talking about architecture or operating models. We're primarily talking about deploying infrastructure and software to identify vulnerabilities, validate those vulnerabilities, and then prioritize their remediation. The ongoing remediation plan, the regulatory internal compliance program, the policy, the compliance, and so forth. Plus all the concerns that we talked about before, operating model at architecture, governance, and organization, are not included. They're assumed. If you measure the two, installing a piece of hardware, is it as complex or as difficult, let's say, as coming up with your information security policy? Well, it's not a valid example, but just trying to give you a sense of complexity and importance. These diagrams help you envision a roadmap, but they do not talk about complexity. Furthermore, automation does not imply maturity. So we know that capability is not the same as maturity. Acceleration through hardware does not achieve maturity. Acceleration through the deployment of technology does not achieve maturity. And then automation, anything and everything DevOps these days, right? Push button automation, check in the code, and have at the other end of the pipeline applications that are ready to be deployed or that are already production ready, fully vetted, no defects. That scenario also does not imply maturity. As a matter of fact, most of the DevOps deployments in the world are pretty immature. If we follow that channel, what this is describing, to assess, which is to onboard, to identify, to validate, remediate, and monitor, that pipeline from an application security perspective describes something that we call a verification program model. And the verification program model does capture the vulnerability, so it tests the application, captures the vulnerability, tracks the vulnerability, reports on it, and makes sure that it's remediated. The monitoring aspect is just making sure that it's not reappearing, but verification program model does not address criticality. It doesn't say, well, maybe for an aerospace, for the aerospace industry, this vulnerability is critical, but perhaps for a university or a hospital, it is not. Maybe we're talking about standards, perhaps the standards and regulations, perhaps the regulations that apply to an insurance company are not the same that apply to a bank. In other words, automating, it's only a subcomponent of the application security program, and once again, having automation does not imply maturity. getting things done faster in a repeatable way does not imply that they're getting done in a better fashion. And that's a corollary. Last but not least, we tend to look at these concerns from the perspective of process, but the reality is it's culture. And shifting our culture from what we know today to where we would want to go is at times difficult. If you look at this roadmap, we're looking at perhaps 70% of the effort dedicated to automation, technology, creation of processes that are specifically geared to support the technology, training that's specific to the support of that technology. But the concerns that gravitate around maturing, right, or the maturation of a program are reduced to maybe 15% of the effort. If you look in the roadmap, we do have an AppSec program maturation cycle post implementation as part of its maintenance mode, and a maturity assessment at the very end of the operate slash transition cycle, which is how well are we doing? Have we done all the things that we wanted to do, and were they done correctly? The shift in culture is the process should focus on all of those aspects in an equal fashion or equally, but more importantly, ensuring that the capability is driven by the level of maturity that we seek, rather than assuming a level of maturity that's based on how much technology we have and how well that technology operates. Now, from an application security capabilities maturity model, we do have a very long path or road ahead. We can measure and monitor the maturity level of most companies at level 1. That is, it's not an enterprise-wide interest. It's spotted or focused to very specific departments that either manage a critical or regulated application, or it's specific to the information security team, or it's specifically to the quality team for these specific subdivisions or members of a parent company, and so forth. A lot of what happens is ad hoc. The reports are run, off cycle once or twice a year, or perhaps applications are being scanned every 3 months. So the point here is the technology is in place. It's not fully controlled, and there's a lot of redundancy within the system. So the same process is being performed by different teams or different entities almost concurrently, but using different approaches. There's no standardization. In other words, chaotic use of the solution. The idea would be to move beyond that point. And most businesses seek to reach a CMM level 2, which allows them to repeat the process over and over and over again. It's properly documented. There's predictability, not only from the perspective of the outputs, but the inputs themselves. There's sanitation of the data. There's a better level of rigor. However, it doesn't truly reflect that level of maturity, the pertaining use of the application security program. What it means is all of the practitioners or affected parties are using the application security program in the same way. So it's not really about the program itself, but how the impacted entities use it. So as you can see, maturity it's an interesting concern when it comes to programs, and in this case, application security programs, because it's not just about technology, it's not just about the people and the training, it's not just about the processes. Maturity is about all those aspects together. I would not recommend to anyone to be, let's say, a CMM level 5, because most businesses are not in the business of producing application security programs. Most businesses are in the business of I want to use an application security program so that my applications can be secure. The other end, CMM level 5, where we're constantly optimizing, looking at new creative ways or innovative ways of delivering these types of capabilities, that be someone that's in the business of doing that. So large software companies, large tech companies, Micro Focus, yep. We are in that business, and the expectation is that we would be using this level of maturity, or operating at this level of maturity, so that we can retrofit that back into the previous levels, defining new ways for the practitioners and the consumers of these capabilities to do it better, faster, and at a lower cost. At this point, we start talking about, well, what are the strategies to ensure that I can optimize and perhaps mature as part of that optimization, my application security program. So here there are two concerns. It's either improve or run. And if we're going to go on the route of, if we're going to take the path of improvement, then we've got to look at architecture. How am I going to architect this application security program? And I have to consider things such as risk appetite. What the risk appetite will drive is how deep, and I'll say it in these terms, how deep into the weeds we are willing to go to address concerns to the level of, is this vulnerability critical or not, right? Is SQL injection critical? Well, maybe for someone that's exposed to the web or a public interface, and users or the consumers of their service are exposed directly to their database, yeah, it might be critical. But if my application lives in the space of firmware and does not persist data, and it uses an awesome product like Voltage to encrypt its payloads while in transit, then SQL injection is not a concern. I don't find it critical. Maybe important, yes, but I would not say it's the end of days. That assertion is driven by the risk appetite, right? How much risk am I willing to accept? In the first case, there's very, very little risk they're willing to accept, so the SQL injection will be critical. In the second case, it could be more relaxed given the circumstances. They're willing to absorb a little bit more of that risk, right? So from an architecture perspective, the key ingredient would be how much risk are we willing to take? And then those items that follow through, governance, the governance concerns, the people concern, and the technology tool sets, then follow through importantly. Notice that on purpose, infrastructure, integration, orchestration, and automation have been left to the end. We're at the bottom of those stacks. If we're looking at how do I run my security operations, then the conversation changes. It's not really about risk appetite, but it's more about service management. How do we ensure that the application security program and the services it renders are done in a way that fulfills or satisfies all of the governance concerns that were put previously in place, the policies and the metrics, right? So do we trust this application security program enough to let it tell us that our risk posture is weak or not, that all of these applications have been properly scanned? Do we have the appropriate controls in place to ensure that through the design, build, and operate phases of any life cycle, the application security program is doing the pertaining monitoring, right? We can reach the same level of understanding if removing the technology from it. In other words, we could do the same type of work, come up with policy, come up with metrics, come up with staffing plans, processes, people planning, service stacks that are vendor agnostic. Let's say instead of calling Fortify static code analyzer, we can just say a static code analyzer of sorts or static application security testing. And then as part of that vendor agnostic service stack and a vendor management policy that could be in place, then determine which static application security products we would like to acquire. But we should not start this venture by saying, and I have acquired this specific product, now I want to build governance around it, now I want to build policies around it, now I want to build all of this capability. The same thing in the case of running security ops. We do not want to gravitate around a specific product, because if the product goes away, all of our processes and runbooks and playbooks become brittle. So as part of a ever-evolving continuous improvement effort, we have to assess the organization constantly. Assessment means we need to engage and understand what are the business concerns that are pervasive through the industry that we belong to. So in the event, let's say we're talking about pharmaceuticals, or we're talking about aerospace, or we're talking about financial sector, we would not want to match what's relevant in the industry of financial services with what's relevant in the aerospace industry. And we would not want to do that because they are governed by different rules. There are different regular entities. They have different types of technology they use. They serve different types of customers and clients. However, we would want to, for example, in the case of financial services, we may find a closer match looking at other financial institutions, insurance companies, perhaps brokers, perhaps anyone that deals with money and accounts and that sort of scenario. So we would want to understand what's relevant in those spaces so that we can compare ourselves to them and then measure a certain level of, I want to say, comfort, if you will, in terms of what are the things or what are the tasks that they are or our peers are doing versus what we are doing. Which practices are in place commonly, and are we meeting those same, or are we exercising those same practices? So that's one level of maturity that we could be, not one level of maturity. It would be a means of measuring maturity through that metric. We'd also want to ensure that the technology that's deployed and the processes that are supported by that technology are a function of the business needs. So there's a business need. Out of that business need comes a process and a set of controls. Then there's technology that either enables or fulfills those processes and those controls. It's not the other way around. We're also looking at maturity from the perspective of comparing ourselves to our peers, maturity from the perspective of ensuring that the technology is supporting processes that are supporting business goals. We're also looking at software quality assurance and looking at how our application security program meets the software quality assurance concerns, and that it's not a perpendicular effort, but it's actually a subcomponent of. So an application security program should be a subcomponent of a software quality assurance strategy. If you don't have a software quality assurance strategy, but yet we're putting together an application security program, we should stop and retool or rethink what we're doing and start from the perspective of SQA to then move into AppSec, right? So software quality assurance, and under software quality assurance, we have software security assurance. An application security program will intersect this software security assurance program and or methodology and effort, and then attach itself as its outputs would attach themselves to an SQA. What I mean with this is if we identify defects in code and we fix those, the software security assurance portion of it is governing that those defects that expose these vulnerabilities are controlled through software quality assurance process. SSA and AppSec programs would not replace quality management. These systems use quality management technologies and processes that should already be in place. One of the most important strategies that an application security program team could put in play is a center of expertise. In some areas or some businesses call them centers of excellency. Center of expertise is a group of peers aligned to an application security program that understand not only the operations concerns around the technology and the processes that are put together, but also around the business problems and the impact of the application security program over those concerns. The Center of Expertise would perform the 5 tasks that we're seeing on the screen right now. And depending upon which aspect of the maturity curve, the process of maturing the application security program, a specific organization might be, all of these 5 areas would have more focus or not. Regardless, all 5 areas are relevant and important. We should look at governance concerns because in order to perform the task, the practitioner needs to understand what's the task to be performed, and then in order to ensure that the concern is or the task is performed adequately, then the objective or the outcome of that task must also be known. So there's a business problem. We're back at technology enables processes that are a function of a business goal or problem. So the governance area would understand the business concerns and then would create rules or policies, metrics that enable measuring or monitoring or enforcing rules and objectives and goals that drive the application security program, right? It would also, the COE would also ensure that resources are available to the practitioners and those beyond the community of application security practitioners. Application security should be, is a concern that impacts all users and all members, direct or indirect, of a business. Well, we know this through many experiences with credit card fraud, right? The end user is being affected by a weakness supplied or injected or available or existing in code that runs a point of sale that's deployed on a vendor's site that connects to a financial institution that connects to a clearing, right, or a credit card operator or a clearinghouse that then approves the disbursement of funds. So it's a complicated chain of events. All those entities participating in that chain are impacted, and those resources should be distributed, right, or should be available to that group. We're looking at awareness campaigns, we're looking at communication plans, we're looking at how to communicate changes to ensure that anyone that's connected to the AppSec program and beyond understand what's happening from the perspective of changes or enhancements or simply put new vulnerabilities or applications that are being taken off certain rotation due to that vulnerabilities in their code, right, or weaknesses that expose the business to unnecessary risk. The Center of Expertise also understands the operations aspect. And here we're talking specifically, for example, about a Fortify platform, but it could be the IBM platform, it could be the Oracle platform, it could be any application security platform to that effect. I just happen to work for Micro Focus, and Fortify is one of my favorite products, but The idea is that the center of expertise not only understands and can drive governance concerns and can make resources available and can communicate, but they can also operate the system. The center of expertise has staff that's highly skilled in the areas of penetration testing, audit, use of the technology, customizing reports, creating custom rules, all those aspects that make the technology and the processes enabled by that technology viable. You need the experts to make sure the machine runs right. And last but not least, we have monitoring. So the center of expertise is consistently being asked for opinion in terms of what things are being done, what's the state of, if you will, state of the program or state of the union. And the center of expertise will pretty much run regular reports on the data it collects. It's not a data lake. It's not different types of data that are sitting on some giant storage facility. We're more talking about structured data that's managed and handled from its point of inception, in this case vulnerabilities, and how those vulnerabilities evolve through time. At that point, we start aggregating quality management system, ticketing and tracking. We look at change logs and deployments of applications that have less or more vulnerabilities. We look at scanning cycles, the depth of the scan cycles. We look at how do we provide a picture, an enterprise picture of all of the activities within the application security program. And the center of expertise has the know-how to perform that. If you look at the strategy per se, an application security center of expertise concentrates in a single entity all of those concerns and subject matter expertise that otherwise would be diluted, as when we talked about CMM level 1, across the enterprise, distributed, very chaotic, with little orchestration or common direction. Center of expertise then enables the business to grow the program in very specific ways, and it would have a budget allocated to it in order to grow that footprint. One person cannot conform a center of expertise. If I have an enterprise that 10,000 employees, if you will, 0.1% of the user population cannot become the center of expertise. That means that for every one person, there are 1,000, right? And assuming that we are using, in this scenario of 10,000 employees, we're using third-party vendors to backfill all those services that we cannot supply by our own teams, then the challenge is even broader. So center of expertise does not imply one or two experts sitting in an office trying to figure this out. A center of expertise is a deliberate strategy that centralizes an organization's experts in the various areas that support application security. As we mentioned before, even the center of expertise for software quality assurance would be a great seed and ground for an application security center of expertise. And I say that because they have the same practitioners. The add-on would be someone or a team of experts that can not only drive this specific technology, but understand the concern of what's a vulnerability and why is it a vulnerability. They would also know how to fix it. So for quality assurance, center of expertise does something equivalent, but instead of being about vulnerabilities, it's about a functional defect and patterns that are, or idioms that are not approved or allowed, right? So it'd be interesting for, no, it wouldn't be, it is interesting to see how centers of expertise evolve across the industry in terms of the adoption by customers adopting the center of expertise strategy in the area of application security so that they can grow their application security program. One of the business cases that I mentioned at the very beginning has implemented a center of expertise, and they have been quite successful at rolling in almost in 3 years. They've almost have 100% coverage of the entire internal application portfolio. So it is a strategy to think about. Now, the other strategy in terms of AppSec programs and maturing them talks about the operations aspect of it. And operating is not only knowing which buttons to push so that output can come out of one end based on the input that was ingested on the other end, but how to operate to improve the value of what we are telling the business. What's the way of making sure that the program is doing what it's supposed to be doing at the cost of at the cost that was initially intended for it? Is it growing at the pace that it should be growing? Acquiring technology to let it age just for the sake of saying, I acquired the technology because someone asked me to, and transforming the entire AppSec program into shelfware is a disservice not only to the employees of that organization, but it's a disservice to the investors, the board of directors, the customers. And I say that because perhaps a few jobs could have been saved had not the organization invested or vested so much emphasis and time onto something that that didn't get used at all, right? The importance of this context of operating the AppSec program is that it is not a one-time thing. Application security programs, once you engage in them, they cannot stop. Again, it's similar to software quality assurance. When as soon as you start writing code and you're concerned about defects and those defects need to be remediated, it never stops. There's always a new developer with a new idea. There's always a new business problem. There's always a new implementation of a solution. There's always an opportunity of a defect. In the case of application security, it's the same. There's always an opportunity for a new vulnerability, perhaps driven by a quality defect. So someone that thought this was the right way of implementing it because it was fast and cool may be exposed in the business to a series of weaknesses and other unknown performance concerns because the pattern or the idioms or the ideas that were implemented did not conform to the vision, the strategy, or the standards set forth by that organization. So operating the AppSec program implies identification of the source of truth for that AppSec program. In this case, we're looking at code repositories and primarily knowing where the code that's being deployed is being contributed from. So is the code that I'm building and putting in production the same code that came out of UAT? And is the code that went into UAT the same code that came out of the developer's workstations when it was checked into the SIT environment, or it was checked into the UAT environment and so forth? I'm sorry, checked out to be used in UAT or checked out to be used in SIT, system integration. We get to that level of assurance because we want to ensure that not only the code has not been contaminated, but that we don't have a point of code injection that is uncontrolled. In other words, maybe we have 10 developers and then there's one developer that's contributing code directly after the initial validations have been done, and they can contribute code, let's say, after UAT has been signed off, for example. That's a potential risk. Another item that we look within the operate is to maintain the system components upkeep of the platform and those items that drive the technology that's relevant and important. An aging platform
that's being used might be indicative of we're not keeping up with the latest and greatest revisions or releases of the product. More important that the engines themselves are actually the rules and the patterns and the signatures that enable these technologies to work, right? Well, specifically in the case of Fortify, application security testing systems, they're driven by rules, and those rules are managed by a third party, in this case, Micro Focus. The point here is if the last time we updated those rules was 2010, we are 9 years behind in terms of new vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that are no longer a concern. Maybe 2010 or 10 years ago, a vulnerability that affected, let's say, Windows 2008 or Windows 2003 is no longer available because, or no longer active because Windows XP is no longer used or is not in use by that organization. So it's a matter of maintaining also upkeep of those platforms. Once again, we can look at each of these items in detail. The point here, however, is that a center of expertise supplies the pretty much the brain power that will feed into this aspect of the application security program, which is the second strategy, operating the AppSec program appropriately and accordingly to the directives that are being set forth by the center of expertise. If there's no center of expertise, the minimum capability required would be proper operation of the AppSec platform or the AppSec program, and you would look at a third party, vendors or consultants or highly trained professionals that can come and enable your teams in these areas, right? Areas of operation, oversight and control enforcement, monitoring and reporting, evaluation of the controls and the activities that are taking place, and even perhaps recommendations as to how to improve or enhance the platform. Once again, maturity is a concern that evolves through time. I am going to take you back to the slides that we mentioned earlier, and I'm going to zoom in right here. So looking at those two strategies, center of expertise and program operation, AppSec program operation, then we can see that in the first scenario of a CMM level 1, the fact that we're able to centralize the operations of the systems and understand from a central location what are the governance concerns and the actual upkeep and run of the system, right? We can walk away saying, well, we're definitely not at level 1. We're not chaotic. We might be a little crazy, but not chaotic. The results and success is not based on it's not on a one-on-one basis. This is more of a team effort. We can repeat that level of success. Perhaps not with the most complex applications, but applications of a certain type. Let's say all of our .NET applications go through the cycle and we have a lot of success. Perhaps applications that were written in, let's say, Turbo Pascal 6.0 20 years ago, we're not having a lot of success. We can also say having the ability to centralize that effort and then ensure that everyone goes through that those processes and that the governance concerns are applied unequivocally and equally to all, then moves us into the far right of the repeatable aspect or level 2, and perhaps gives us the opportunity to move into CMM level 3. And from a capability maturity model perspective, this means that we do have sufficient processes and standards in place to say common practice for code development states that Thou shalt not use component blank. Thou shalt code in this fashion, pattern. Thou shalt. So it gives a closer, it gives a higher chance of having a center of expertise and proper operation, gives a higher chance of achieving this type of goal where we are deliberate in terms of the things that we allow or do not allow to move from a developer's workstation into a production environment, regardless if the developer's workstation is inside, it's a homegrown development, or if it's a third-party development. That would be irrelevant. The relevancy would be, do we have the controls in place to ensure that that code is using such and such and such parameter standards or patterns. I'm not sure that a lot of organizations will fall into CMM level 4. That's a little bit above and beyond the initial capabilities that most organizations set for themselves. If you recall, we started the discussion talking about technology replacing technology as maturity. So if I have a lot of technology, that means I'm a mature organization when it comes to application security programs. Now what we're saying is, in order to be mature, the enterprise needs to understand the concern, right? We have to take application security as part of our corporate DNA. It's not something that some director of some division in some company that's part of the holding decided to do, and then it's being slapped on our faces. But it's rather a orchestrated effort from every employee within that organization to ensure that their applications are secure, they're safe to use, that the code is not exposing the business to unnecessary risk. I think in what I've seen on businesses and organizations that take this approach is that they do both of those strategies do help them achieve higher levels of maturity, not because it's faster, not because there's some sort of superpower that's then instilled into the organization, but rather because the efforts become focused, concentrated, properly aligned, properly organized. So you don't have the effort is not diluted, but it's more of a single effort and everyone's walking at the same pace.
Wow, thanks so much, William. Some really great stuff there. So before I pass it off to Stan, let's just recap what William covered, because that was a lot of great information to digest. Luckily, this is being recorded, so you can watch it back as many times as you want to afterwards. At the top of the presentation, I quickly talked about how organizations can't just rely on the basics, but William really dug into how organizations must really embrace AppSec as part of its cultural fiber. Application security includes employees, competitors, processes, products, vendors, regulations, and practice. Because of all those factors, AppSec is a never-ending journey and engagement. But if you feel like you or your organization isn't ready to begin that journey, we here at Fortify can certainly help. On that note, I'm going to pass it over to Stan to discuss 3 use cases where Fortify did that very thing, help them mature their AppSec program. Over to you, Stan.
Many firms get started with Fortify on Demand since it's easier to get started and to scale. This global consumer packaged goods company has more than 2,000 brands worldwide, each with its own web presence. Approximately 10% of these sites conduct e-commerce. Others support marketing campaigns to build customer relationships. The sites collect sensitive customer information connected to back-end systems, and the situation is complicated by the fact that most websites are created by external agencies. The firm aims to ensure compliance with security policies and they increase efficiency by choosing only high-scoring agencies. When looking at alternatives for security testing, one option for the firm was traditional penetration testing. This was 10 times too expensive given the number of sites and rate of change. Another was to have an outsourcing company create a custom solution, also too costly. The firm chose Fortify on Demand after a proof of concept showed that it was the most effective and cost-efficient solution. Now they've scaled to thousands of scans a year. The firm uses FOD for both web and mobile applications, which are complicated to test because 3 components must be tested: the code on the mobile phone, the back-end web services, and the network between the two. ANZ Bank is a great example of a firm that's integrated in our on-prem static code analyzer with their development processes and dev tool chains to help ensure that code is secure prior to going into production. As I mentioned before, given the pace of development and the need for security to be an enablement of business objectives, application security testing must be integrated into the dev toolchain and development processes to reduce friction. ANZ Bank is one of the best out there at doing this. They've also changed the culture to one where developers are security aware and they're producing code compliant to secure coding best practices that they've set. Many firms are taking a hybrid approach where they're doing some testing on-prem, but also leveraging our on-demand service. This is exemplified in our last example by a large oil and gas firm. Some of the challenges were the resource churn and inconsistent testing, compliance requirements for PCI, and general complexity of their testing program. Their maturity journey has taken them years, and they've continued to progress to the right, leveraging a variety of our technologies. Fortify on Demand provides the firm's internal developer and application security testing teams with self-service to automate code scans for hundreds of applications, saving time and cost compared to using in-house resources. The Fortify on Demand solution also brings greater continuity of testing across all application development groups by eliminating the turnover common among third-party contractors, who also use a variety of different testing tools. But the firm is also using SCA and SSC on-prem to continuously look for vulnerabilities across in-house, mobile, and third-party applications. The results have been significant. They've greatly reduced the number of critical and high vulnerabilities while lowering the cost of the application security program. By leveraging FOD and automating the dev tool chain, they've accelerated application time to market on an average of 10 days. Security is no longer slowing things down. And finally, they've improved productivity by freeing up over 24,000 hours of developer and security time that can be used on other initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stan. So before we go, I just wanted to talk briefly about Fortify. Fortify is the industry-recognized application security solution that integrates seamlessly with your existing tools and processes to secure your applications. It's easy to get started with Fortify on Demand and easily scales by leveraging scan automation and flexible deployment options. Our tools integrate with the software that matters to you, such as industry-leading technologies like Jira, Jenkins, Visual Studio's, Eclipse, ALM Octane, and more. Fortify is fast, accurate, and scalable while offering the broadest programming language support in the market, currently covering 25 languages with more to come. I encourage you to contact us today to learn more about how Micro Focus Fortify can help you get started or get to that next step of maturity with your AppSec program. You can also visit our website now and download a free trial of our cloud-based solution, Fortify on Demand. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar, and a special thanks to William and Stan for their time today as well. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and have a great rest of your day.